So hi, everyone. Welcome back to another week of EGS. As I said before, I've already sent the attendance sheet into the chat. I will be sending it again at the very end for anyone who's missed it. But more importantly, this week, we have the fabulous Rachel Sima from Firaxis Games. Did I say your last name right?
You did, yes.
Fabulous. We have Rachel Sima from Firaxis Games coming to talk about what it's like to work as a game producer and how to manage things like your pitch, your scope, team dynamic, and other things like that. Rachel has over 4 years, correct me if I'm wrong, of experience in the game design industry, ranging from things like PHL Collective's Ben 10 Power Trip, working as the chair of Philly IDGA, and producing the game Life is Strange True Colors. She currently works at Firaxis, as I said before, working on things I'm not actually sure of, and I'm not sure if you can say either.
Never.
Hush, hush. But yeah, if you want to, feel free to take it away.
Yeah, totally. Let me figure out sharing here. Hopefully this will just work. All right, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
All right, let me get this like presenter view thing going. All righty. All right, I think we are good. All right, well, yes, as AJ said, I'm Rachel. I am a game producer and currently I work at Firaxis Games, which is not too far away. It's right outside of Baltimore. So I'm back on the East Coast after a small hiatus, which is very exciting. So yeah, it feels right for me to be talking to you all after like nearly 2 years of not really giving any like public talks or anything like that. Because I briefly went to Drexel and I got my start in Philadelphia and the surrounding area. So it feels good to be chatting with people who are back in places that I'm super familiar with. So yeah, as I just said, I'm gonna share some experiences of making small games with small teams through the lens of game producerhood, which is what I've done for the past like 4 or 5 years. And I've done some other things, but yeah, that's sort of who I am and why hopefully I will be able to impart some helpful tips to you today. So I've worked on games of just about every type, mobile, VR, console games, and worked with teams of all sizes, ranging from like 10 developers to over 200, which is where I currently work. And I think that experience has just given me a little bit of perspective on working on smaller games and the pros and cons and being able to look and compare and contrast that experience. So this is kind of where I started. I did some freelance like writing when I was in high school, which was very lucky. I didn't know at the time, but that was going to get me my first internship and then my job at Island Officials, which is where I worked first. This is in South Jersey, and they still make games, although it's mostly like a website design company at this point. Then I worked at PHL Collective, working on games like, as AJ said, Ben 10, which I was a producer, and I also wrote most of that game as well, which was a lot of fun. I've seen every episode of Ben 10. If you have any trivia, hit me up. But yeah, working in Philadelphia was where I got my first like bigger indie job. We made games like top right there is the We Bare Bears VR game that we made where you run a food truck. That was awesome. And then there at the bottom is just some of the mobile games that I worked on. And actually in the top right of that panel, there's a little rainbow lady. And that was from a game called Queen of Space, which is actually still on the Phillytron. Which was rehoused from Indie Hall this week. Unfortunately, they are moving locations, and now it's going to live at Color Space Labs in Fishtown. So if you ever go there, they have First Friday events when things are not shut down. So yeah, you can check it out and lots of other cool games that were made in Philadelphia. And after that, I went to work at Deck 9, which is where I worked on Life is Strange True Colors, which comes out this year, I believe in September. And that was kind of my first move into like big games. And it was a big change and I learned a lot there. working on like cinematic adventure games, and then moved to Firaxis Games at the beginning of this year, which is where I am currently. If you aren't familiar, Firaxis is a studio that makes Civilization, XCOM, etc. And all of our current games are unannounced, but hopefully in the future, I will be able to come tell you all about them. Just some other things I wanted to call out because I think it's really important for people who are trying to get into the industry. I think a lot of what I learned personally about game production, about working in the industry, came from doing volunteer work and work with organizations like these. So I was a board member when they restarted the Philadelphia IGDA. I chaired it for a little while. Philly Game Mechanics, if you aren't going to their events, everything's virtual right now, but that is really, I think, like the heart of the indie game scene in Philadelphia, and the people who run that to this day are incredible people. The past few years, I've been a regional organizer with Global Game Jam, and that's been a ton of fun. You get to meet people, all over the world and work with the site organizers to kind of make sure that they're prepared for what it takes to run a game jam. And then this last one here, I would definitely recommend for people who are interested in going to GDC. I think going as a conference associate, which is kind of like a volunteer, but you get paid like a stipend that might cover like your flight, basically. You get a free pass to GDC, all access, and you get to hang out with all the other conference associates who are not just students. Like, these are people who are often mid to senior in their careers and work the conference and get to go see talks and stuff like that. That definitely helped me with networking, and I would 100% recommend to anyone who wants to go to GDC to look into the conference associate program. All right, so that's who I am. I want to talk about really quickly, what is a game producer, since that is kind of the lens that I'm looking at games through. And I think that it's a little bit nebulous sometimes, sort of what that role is. And I think that it's hard to define because it is so different in so many different studios, but I'm going to give it a shot here. And I think there are some good definitions, specifically these pillars of production from a talk by Ruth Tomendil. Unfortunately, this is one of those GDC talks that is not on YouTube, although she does have others that are on YouTube that are really good, whether you want to be a game producer or not. But basically, the pillars boil down to organization. So managing budget, timelines, keeping up with your Jira and project management software. Facilitation, which is more like unblocking your team when there are things preventing them from doing their work, making sure that decisions get made on time, and ordering pizza when your team is there late. Inspiration is more like your team is here late. How do you make them feel better about that? How do we reframe the things that we do to feel more meaningful and to make people just feel more satisfied with their job and feel heard? But it's essentially all the things that surround the making of and upkeep of making games on time, on budget, and to the intended quality, which is an important part of being a game producer, because nobody cares if you ship a really bad game on time. So in summary, producers are really people-focused. We work with people all day long. As an introvert, I definitely did not think this was going to be like the path that I took, but I really love spreadsheets. And that was my skill walking into it. And over time, I have definitely built the skill of working with and interacting with people, which you can do, by the way. I was skeptical, but it can happen. And most producers are not bosses. We're not really the people who are managing people's like career trajectory. We're not hiring and firing people typically, unless you are the manager of a production team. We are not community managers or marketing people typically. Definitely some producers get given that job, especially at smaller studios, but it's not really a core feature of the role. We do definitely support the marketing teams. Like if a trailer team needs assets, they'll usually go through someone like me. And producers often do press because typically they are people who are better at public speaking, working with people, following rules, like don't talk about NDA things. And then we're also not creative directors. So typically they won't be like approving an art asset. They're not going to be telling you that your level is good and you should pass it to the next team member. But there's a lot of aspects of our job that affect the end quality and creative vision of the project, such as prioritizing bugs. Typically that goes to production, and it matters what bugs we decide to do or not do for the end vision of that game. So that is something that we do that impacts the look and feel. So my hope is today that I can kind of talk about some of these topics that I think will be relevant for some of you at the moment. If you are either gearing up to pitch and work on a project, or if you are at the tail end of working on a project and are kind of thinking about how you want to finish that out. Cool, so I'm going to call this vision sharing, but it's essentially pitching and marketing mostly. And this is, wanting other people to get buy-in on your idea, whether they're giving you a grade and they're your teacher, if they are paying you to make a game like a publisher, or if they are purchasing your game from a marketplace, like, they're your customer. This experience that I'm speaking from is mostly from indie development when I worked more on like business type things, as well as like some of the marketing stuff that we do with, in AAA and AA games. So the first thing I would say if you are starting out and you're going to pitch a project is you have to understand what it is that makes your game awesome. You have to understand what it is you're trying to make. I think that is maybe common sense to say, but I have definitely seen those moments where publishers are grilling creative directors and they just don't have the right answers, or they don't seem very excited about the project that they are pitching, and that does not go over well. There's often millions of dollars at stake when we're doing pitching and marketing, and it's really important to know what the key pieces of your pitch and marketing plan are. So I would suggest, if you have a small game, think about the way that like board games market their products, right? They're usually small and they want to get the point across pretty effectively with a limited amount of, content. So like, for example, here is the Sim Golf marketing materials. And this was a game that Firaxis put out, I think in the early 2000s. And it's kind of funny because I sent these slides to my manager this afternoon, and she was looking through them and was like, oh, is that an example of good marketing? Because I made that. And I was like, oh, it is. But you can see here, this product knows what makes it special, right? So the whole idea of Sim Golf was, it's kind of like Zoo Tycoon or Roller Coaster Tycoon, where you are creating a golf course, right? And so they've got clear pillars, right? Customize, build, play, and design. And the images next to those pillars are clear. They illustrate what those mechanics do, and the text is maybe not so much now that it has been compressed and put into my PowerPoint, but the text is pretty clear. It's legible, and yeah, I think it's a good example of how you can use something like older games or board games to illustrate your ideas. And this would be something that now people might call like a sell sheet. People make them when they go to shows a lot. So I would think about using something like this. And when you are making marketing materials or pitch documents, definitely keep in mind some of these things. So people communicate differently and process information differently. Some people are very visual learners, for example, whereas like I'm someone who likes to read things, and that's how I retain information best. So use the different types of communication available to you. If you're making like a video, definitely have audio that matches the tone of your prototype or pitch or whatever it is. Use text and make sure that it's legible. Don't use colors that are traditionally like related to color blindness. And for pitches like something like this, like a presentation, think about trying to use like big fonts, like bigger than you would think. I think 30 point is the lowest that they suggest going. And then also like good visuals. They don't have to be like, I mean, we can look at this. They don't have to be like masterpiece level visuals, especially if you're pitching like a prototype. These images are simple, they get the point across, and they fit like the tone of the product. And then lastly, don't be afraid to repeat yourself as far as vision sharing. So whether you are talking to publishers and explaining to them why they should publish your product, or whether you are trying to sell to someone like at a show, definitely remember that what feels like it's too repetitious to you is still new information to the people that you're talking about. You really want to nail home the things that are the most important, specifically like the unique things. That's what publishers, for example, always want to hear about, is what makes this game different than every other game they've played, and why would a player buy your game instead of this game that already exists. Something else on both the marketing and pitching side is screenshots. This is something that I wish I had known about when I worked on smaller games. When you're trying to communicate an idea, definitely check out this blog post. It's made by the Finji team, who are the ones that publish actually Chicory and Wandersong and also Night in the Woods. But they did a really good blog post here about how to create great screenshots for your game. And I pulled this screenshot from XCOM because I think it illustrates it really well. Basically, the idea is you're telling a story with every screenshot, right? So you want to kind of get an idea of what happened before this moment, what is currently happening, and what is going to happen. So in this screenshot, you can see there's a soldier who has, it seems like, snuck up to this big alien blob creature. We are now targeting the creature. It makes it clear what the UI and the core game mechanic is, right? You are trying to shoot these aliens. That's the game. It has a good point of interest. The alien is not facing you, right? So it creates a lot of like interest and mystery. And it tells a story that you're about to shoot this alien, and who knows what's going to happen. Will you succeed, right? It has like a percentage on screen, right, of will this player actually hit the alien. So I think I will be sharing, the slides here, and I can also link to everyone this blog post, but I would highly recommend trying to implement some of these things, whether it's on these projects or when you go out in the world and try and, share your ideas with people, because I think it does make a really big difference in selling people on your product. And also, you want screenshots a lot earlier than you think you would. I remember working on specifically indie games, and we would go to shows, and people would ask us to, like, for example, we showed at the Franklin Institute a few times, and we wanted to like put up marketing materials and stuff on our booth to get people excited about the game. And every time we did something like that, we'd find that we just like didn't have anything that we had already taken screenshots of. And it was like a mad dash to get all of our content and marketing materials together. And it does not need to look beautiful, right? Like if you have a prototype, you don't need polished art necessarily. But I would definitely look at trying to capture and getting a backlog of those things early, rather than leaving all of that right before you need to actually show someone your product. And when you're working with publishers, this is again something I wish that I knew. Even if you aren't working with a publisher and you are self-publishing, right? Lay out the core risks to your project and keep that up. So when you start a project, I think a lot of people are not going to be making the exact same game over and over again. And there's always going to be risks and unknowns around what it is that you're going to be making. So lay those things out and be honest, especially if you're working with a publisher. It may seem counterintuitive to be sharing with them, what do you think is going to make this project fail? But actually, a lot of times they want to know that. They want to know what you think the reason that it's going to fail is, because they've already made their list. They already have an idea of why they think it's going to fail. So you lay out the risks. So for example, a risk, impact, and mitigation document might be, Jim, our programmer, he fell and he broke his arm, right? And so Jim, he's incredible. He can type with one hand. He'll just be half as fast, right? So that's our risk. Jim broke his arm. And the impact is Jim can program half as fast, right? So what are our mitigation steps? Some of the options could be we hire another programmer who has one hand and can fill the other 50% of Jim's work. Or we build a robot, right, to do the work that Jim can't do now. Just as, wild examples. But this is really useful, especially internally, because you can look at this and think about how you can get ahead of these risks. And keeping it up to date, I think, is really important. So that's a piece of advice, and most publishers will ask for this. And then along the lines of vision sharing, a little bit less on the topic of like outside of your team, but inside, it's also important to kind of have a shared idea of what it is that you're making and trying to sell. So documentation is super important. My little emojis here are trying to tell you, like, don't write books of documentation. Write concise and accurate documentation that you can keep up to date. If you write too much, it's going to take way too much time to keep it up to date, and no one's going to want to read that. So most teams I've worked with now use something like a wiki, or something that is shared across people and everyone can edit and look at the same time is something really useful. And for shorter games, it may feel not as important to do something like documentation, but it is really useful if you ever have someone join your project. I've definitely had people who, okay, someone's joining your team next week, and we don't have anything prepared for how to tell them how to work on our project or what our project is. That is not a good position to be in. So it's great if you have those resources, and you can also, reference them or send them out to people who you're trying to pitch to as supplemental resources. So definitely recommend using documentation as a resource for vision sharing within your team and outside. And in summary, just try and create a united vision across your project. Get eyes on the right parts of your project. So why is it unique? Why do people want to buy it? And highlight the pieces that you think are really awesome. And then always be ready to show your project, whether that's to new team members or having marketing materials ready to go, or being ready to pitch to publishers. All right, so let's talk about my favorite thing, scoping games and keeping them in scope. So this is there's always a relevant XKCD comic, right? So this one is about keeping projects in scope and how you might as well just not try. You should just not waste your time. But I'll let you read this while I drink tea. All right, so my advice to you, unsurprisingly, as a game producer, is you should use some kind of project management software. It doesn't really matter what it is, in my opinion. People have very strong opinions about project management software, myself included, but I don't think it matters that much which one you choose if you are just trying to familiarize yourself with those products and you're making games that are, not massive productions. So any of these things, some of them are free, definitely will work for you. I look at project management software as a tool for making decisions, right? Almost every single one of these is some kind of database with a UI in front of it. If you're using something like Excel, maybe much less of a UI in front of it. But it's all for storing data that then you can then leverage to make decisions. And we can look at that. These are the things that I think that you should be tracking. If you aren't, I would say there's probably a gap that you will wish that you had tracked at some point. So here's an example that I put below, just like, this is how you could do it in Excel. I think that's the lightest weight and least great version of tracking your tasks, but you can add up all your estimated hours and I guess it works, right? So tracking a task name and description so you know what the task is, having an estimate, whether that's hours, days, story points, which it would be cool to come back and just talk about story points for an hour because they're awesome. Are you familiar with that? Like, is that something that you guys are learning about at all? Agile things?
I'm familiar with Agile, but I've never heard story points. I don't know.
Story points, they're magic. People also have strong opinions about those. But yeah, I would say for your purpose, hours and days is probably fine, especially when you're using small teams. Having an assignee, this is how you keep people accountable and also so you know what you're supposed to be getting done. Having a priority, which we'll talk about later, why priority is such an important thing to be able to track long-term on your project. And I see teams, even big teams on big projects are not tracking priority and later they regret it. And then some kind of due date, whether that's like you're committing things to a sprint, whether you are setting a date something needs to get done, or you're saying this item needs to be done before this item, that's probably pretty helpful to track. All right, and I would also suggest putting tasks, if you start a project, I would suggest putting tasks in as a group. Meet for an hour and just write down all the things you know are gonna be in your game. I think doing it individually can be good if you know of one item that you want to have in your game, but really, I think what makes project management software so powerful is that everyone can get an aligned vision on what it is you're trying to make. So even if your initial tasks are huge, like create a player character or make 3 maps, that's okay, but I would put them in together as a group initially. And this also gets you used to looking at your backlog together. I would use this as a place to track your changes. If you decide you're making 4 maps instead of 3, that should be reflected in wherever you're tracking your tasks so that you can see, can we still finish this game or not? Here's an example of how I like to think about tasks kind of evolving through the stages of a project. Like early on, it's totally okay to write in your backlog, create a player character. You may not know a lot about what your player character is, but then by week 3, hopefully you've got some design together and you can break it down a lot more into things like modeling, rigging, texturing, and then, you know, what animations do you need? I will also say, like, putting estimates on things early on is very useful because if we say create a player character should take 3 weeks, but then when we break it down into all these pieces, all those pieces add up to 6 weeks, we can look and see, okay, well, what are the things that are taking the most time? Will this still fit within our timeline? And you can start to get better at estimating how long things are going to take you, which is really important if you ever want to move into like a AAA, AA game industry, because people like me are going to come ask you all the time how long things take. And I'm sorry, but it's really awesome when people know. All right, this is something else I wanted to show you just as one of the final things around like scoping. This is a really powerful tool. Do any of you like generally know how to read a burn down chart? Yes, okay. I'm getting at least one nod. All right, I'm gonna give a quick overview of how to read a burn down chart, because I think this is one of the tools that as a small team is incredibly powerful to have. So basically, let me get my mouse here. All right, hopefully you can see my mouse, yes? Okay, so you've got this chart here. Basically you've got two lines, and that's what's important, and you've got two axes. So your y-axis here is basically the amount of work you have. So whether that's in days, hours, points, whatever. And then the x-axis is the time you have to do that work. So here we've got 0 days to 20 days. So this would be a 20-day project. We want to either track between the start of a project to an end, or like the start of a sprint to the end, because our goal is to get to 0 hours or days of work by the end. So this blue line here is basically saying if we start with 30 units of work, by day 20, if we want to have 0 units of work, here's how much work we have to do. The red line is how much work do we actually have left. So sometimes the red line, and this is okay, will be above the blue line, meaning we have more work than would be ideal if we want to finish all the work. When we're below the blue line, it means we have less work than we thought would be ideal. And that's totally normal. Your project will never follow like an ideal trend line. It's not how games really work. But this tool is incredibly useful for tracking scope and whether you are going to finish your project or not. I would just look up burn down charts. There's a million tutorials on how to make them, even in like Excel. And every project management software has a tool to use these, but I would highly recommend using them because it gives you an actual metric, not just a gut check on whether you're going to finish your project. This is something else that you might see a lot in smaller game development. I know I use this a lot in like small indie productions. It's called a Gantt chart. If you don't know how to read one of these, it's basically the things that start at the top left are first, and the things at the bottom right are last. And people have different opinions, but I think these are not used as much in like modern game development productions. And these are incredibly time consuming to keep accurate. And I would just personally avoid them. I would not use this as a method for tracking your projects and schedules. For high level schedules, like we should generally have a map done at this point. I think that's fine, but I would not use this as like your visual for individual tasks being completed. So in summary, have one place where your tasks live, keep your information up to date, and keep eyes on the scope of your project using tools, because the name of the game when you have a small team, which we'll talk about, is keeping really efficient use of your time. You don't have a lot of it. And yes, this is family emojis, but you know what? Some people are short like I am. And so that's me in the bottom middle. So yeah, working on small teams is awesome in some ways because you're really only communicating with a handful of people at a time. You don't need to get every person, you know, at a giant company on board for a design decision. But at the same time, you don't have a lot of people to fall back on if you start to fall behind. So let's talk about some of the pitfalls also of small teams that I would suggest trying to avoid. So here's my friends from, I really hope everyone knows what Team Fortress 2 is. I realized as I put this in here that like Team Fortress 2 was the end of my, like, I don't know, young gaming years. So now I don't know if people know what it is, but that's what this is from. And there's a joke about they wear a lot of hats, okay? So if you don't get the joke, that's why it's funny. But on small teams, you often wear a lot of hats or have a lot of responsibilities. Rarely are you going to find small teams where, you know, there is a producer who does only production work or an artist who only works on one map or something like that. But wearing multiple hats doesn't mean that you can't establish roles for yourself. So these are the character names. There's the spy, the medic, and the pyro. And we're going to establish, those are their roles. Even in, larger game development spaces, I think that this still becomes an issue where people's roles overlap. And so you may have 3 concept artists, for example, and it is unclear whose responsibility is what. And so even further than this, I think when you start a project, it's really good to talk about who owns what. And this can be pretty general. Like if you are the artist, you own the artistic direction, right? You may be acting more as like an art director if you're the only artist on a 5-person project. And I think it is good to try and set those expectations early, because while games are very collaborative and it's important to work together well, if you need to work on a tight timeline, you need to be able to make decisions really quickly. So when something comes up, like there's disagreement about a piece of art, it's really important to let everyone give their opinion and have a vote. But at the end of the day, it is most efficient to have someone who can make the call. And it allows you to spend less time like waffling about, so you can make some decision. And if you go make that piece of art that you weren't sure about and nobody likes it, then you can still have time to fix it because you didn't spend all your time making a decision. So I would definitely set clear boundaries on who's going to own what pieces of the project. Also, definitely take notes in meetings. This is a really low impact way to create accountability and responsibility on your team. Take turns. Definitely one person should not always be the note taker unless for whatever reason they love to do that. But it's a skill that everyone should be building, because everyone, may be called on to do that later in their career. So capture the who, the what, the when, and the how. For example, do not just write down in your notes, we decided we're going to give the bird a little hat, because what does that mean? Everyone's going to go, awesome, the bird will have a little hat, and they'll walk away thinking that's going to happen. Create action items like Jessica is going to model the bird's little hat next week, something like that. It can be very simple, but it creates accountability. And for people who are not present at your meetings, it's really important to be able to share that information without spending somebody's time, which is already limited, working on telling them everything that happened at the last meeting. So definitely action items, get the details, and make sure that everyone is comfortable taking notes. All right. So now we're going to go into our last little section here of wrapping up a project. I was going to put a quote by Churchill here. That was pretty good, but then that felt like, no, that felt like everyone puts, quotes in their presentation. So I just wrote the thing that I was going to try to tell you via quote, and I just wrote it out. That's what I'm trying to tell you. If you don't plan for polish and bug fixing, it won't happen. You just won't do it. And then you'll just have a game that isn't polished and you'll have lots of bugs. Not planning for it will not make your game polished or bug free. I promise you, I've been there. Some of you may have heard of this, Parkinson's law. It's basically, if you have the same amount of work, that work will expand to fit the time given. So you may believe that the work that you have takes you 2 weeks, but if you give yourself 8 weeks to do it, you will probably still take the full 8 weeks, and it will feel like it should have taken that amount of time. You may have also heard the saying, very popular in game development, the last 10% is 90% of the work, which it really does feel true when you have 1 month left of your project and no final art. So I'm just trying to show you, yes, if you don't plan for it, it won't happen. I'm just going to put that up there again, just to really reinforce it. So don't leave all your polish for the end. Also, if you are regularly looking at your game, playing your game as a group, take those notes of what it is you would like to polish and prioritize them against the work that you have left. It's possible that polishing the animations for your player character is actually more important than, you know, creating the little houses that are going to go in the distance on your maps. So the stuff that you make in the first week probably will not look the same as the stuff you're making 3 months into your project, and you should plan for that because you're going to get better at making your game. At big studios, we do something called a check-in freeze. So before every major milestone or when you're going to be delivering your game for like Gold Master, we stop check-ins. So if you're using something like Perforce, basically we say, unless it is a tier 1 bug or something that is like going to make the build more stable, you're not allowed to check it in anymore. And we will revert it if you do. Because we are basically saying, this is your moment to do the thing we planned for, which is bug fixing. I would anticipate doing something like that for your project if you're able, just setting aside like, all right, we're going to finish 2 weeks early. And those last 2 weeks, we're going to spend on making this game awesome. And of course, that timeline will depend on how long you have to make your game. If it's a game jam, you might spend half a day polishing your game, but still set aside that time to make sure your game runs and it looks cohesive. And this is where utilizing priority is so important. If you have a huge list of bugs and a huge list of polish items, it's going to be really hard to, at the last minute, figure out what is the most important if you have never put priority on anything in your project management tool backlog. You can just go down the list in priority order if you have put priority on things, right? From very high to very low. And the things that are very low, it doesn't matter if they don't get done because we already decided they aren't that important. And also, you should be working in that way all the time. It seems intuitive, but I often find that developers will work on the easiest thing first, as opposed to the most important thing. And that is absolutely asking for you to have something come up that stops you from working on your game, and you will not have the important things done, but all the easy things will be finished. So consider that and try and balance that for your workload. All right. And in summary, basically understand what is the essential polish for your game. Put polish and bug fixing into your schedule, plan for it, or else it will not happen. And make sure that you do the important stuff first, as opposed to the easy stuff or the stuff that's the most fun. All right, and then I have a couple slides here of unsolicited advice from my experience. So there's a couple of items here, and it may not all be popular, but definitely this is an easy one. Don't just look for studios that are making your dream game or, you know, made the games that you love as a kid, which is ironic for me to say because working at Firaxis is the job that I wrote down as a child that like I wanted to have. I loved Civilization as a kid, and it's a dream working there. Working with people who like made the games you played as a kid, it's wild. And they hate it too, because I talk about how I was a child when I played it and they're like, oh God. But definitely look for the teams that are awesome and the culture that is awesome, because that is what will keep you somewhere for the long term. Also, I think it's popular now to like say, networking is not just going up and exchanging business cards, making friends. I think everyone kind of knows that at this point, but seriously, it's not always the people you think who are going to get you jobs. Things can change very quickly. Layoffs are very prevalent in the game industry, and just make sure that you're always letting the ladder down behind you, because at some point that person that you're helping will help you. That has been my experience even in the 5 years I've been in the industry. Here's one that may hurt. Write a unique resume and cover letter for any job that you want to be hired for. seriously, I have read a lot of cover letters and resumes, hiring junior and mid-level and even senior producers. And a lot of people make the same mistakes. You see a shocking number of people who put the wrong studio name in their materials. You will see, yeah, just people who clearly are applying for a job they made up in their head and not the job that we gave them all the information for. Use the job posting and don't lie, but if you fit the job, you should be like referencing the job posting in your resume and cover letter and making it unique and clear that you really want this job. And yes, it takes more time, but the chances you are going to get hired are so much higher. It is definitely worth doing. Also, if you are unsure of what a cover letter or resume should look like in the game industry, I am happy to share mine. So, you know, you can send me an email, it'll be on a slide, and I will share it with you and give you thoughts on yours if you want, because I paid someone to actually help me. I'd had a fine resume and cover letter, and I paid someone to help me bring it to an even better level. And it made a big difference when I was doing applications and looking for a new job. For AAA, if your dream is to work on a huge game at a huge studio, then you should look at trying to specialize in whatever field it is. I know it's hard early on because you don't really know what you're interested in, but as soon as you're able to, start looking at the things that make you unique as opposed to the people that you're competing with, or those jobs that are very like specialized. So for example, I had experience in cinematic game production, and that's gotten me interest from studios when I applied. It made it much easier to sell, okay, well, here's why you should hire me for this game that has tons of cinematics. And that won't always work. You may not always get a job that way, but it does make things easier. Also, just in case anyone's interested, I wrote a little like list of jobs that I keep hearing this year are in like insane demand. So combat designers I just hear all the time, people are looking for combat designers. UI and UX is incredibly important now. Like, I think the game industry has woken up and been like, oh, okay, yes, we need that. Accessibility, all that kind of fits into the UI and UX field, and that is super in demand. Lighting artists, super great. You should probably look at like learning some film and things like that to do that, but it's a very in demand job. And then one that I always hear about because I'm a producer is technical producers. So that's like a producer who can speak easily and do essentially the job of a programmer. That's hard to find because a lot of programmers don't really want to be producers. A lot of those skills aren't really overlapping in some ways. So it's one that is harder, I think, for studios to fill the role of. And being a lone wolf, trying to like make your game as a I don't know, what do they call it now? Like, yeah, just trying to do it all by yourself, or glorifying the idea of carrying the weight of 5 people on your team. It's not a good look. It's not going to get you far in the industry. That's not really something teams look for. I would say almost every studio I've worked at, people are much more interested in working with people who are pleasant, who are good team members, even if they are slightly less skilled than someone who is just not fun to work with. Like, you have to spend at least 40 hours a week with these people. You want them to be nice and pleasant people. And then lastly, because sometimes I think that it's not always clear, but making games for a living can be really fun. You have to find the right place to do it. You have to find the right people and the right projects. Sometimes it can be really not fun, but for the most part, I would say, despite what you may hear from many game developers, it can be a lot of fun day to day to make video games for a living. All right, well, that is what I have. I'm super happy to go into more detail on anything I covered. I think it was a little bit more broad, And I tried to just get more information in there. But yeah, if you have any questions or would like to know more about anything, let me know.
So I guess I'll go first. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your experience with EGS students. I have two questions that I want to ask you. The first one is, there may be students, especially within EGS, working in small teams, who may say, you know, it might be a team of 3 or 4. Each of us have such a very specific job, doing art or doing programming. We don't have time for production. I feel like thinking about the production process is important, maybe even more so for the smaller team. Can you sort of speak about the core, why you feel they might be important even for a small team? That's the first question. And the second question is, I mean, you don't have to answer this if it goes outside the scope, but we have a number of women in EGS hoping to go into the game industry, but the news coming from the game industry is kind of awful, especially with Blizzard, Activision, and before that, Riot and others. What would your advice be for the women who are passionate and want to go into the game industry, but you were facing such a headwind, right, coming from the treatment of women in the industry in general, and so on? So those are 2 questions that I have.
Yeah, so for the first, I would say that is sort of, I am sympathetic to the fact that doing those production processes and trying to fit that into an already pretty intense workload, and I'm sure making these games is not the only thing that you're doing as a student or an aspiring game developer. Definitely think about the ways in which you can limit the time it takes to do those things. So for example, like I call that note taking, right? You're already having a meeting, do that. If you're already having a meeting, that's when you can look at something like a team backlog, where you can just have that up, share your screen, or if you're in the same room, have a computer up with the backlog that you can just in real time make changes to the tasks that you have. You definitely have to find ways to make it as lightweight as possible for yourself. And you don't need to get super fancy. You don't need to spend a ton of money on any sort of solutions. But yeah, I would say without project management and without the production aspect of game development, you're going to have a much harder time being efficient because you don't have that tool at your disposal. And it is definitely worth having someone or a group of people putting some time towards that to be like a force multiplier for everyone's work. And to the note of, the news out of the game industry is bad this week, very bad. So yeah, I was talking about that when we first started. I think I'm from the optimistic side. I will say, I think this is ideally growing pains, and the reckoning that we're seeing is, things coming to light. There's a lawsuit, that is progress. These things are being taken seriously, and that people are being fired from these positions. But at the same time, I would not, kid yourself that this is the most welcoming industry to join. I do think that if you find the right studios and the right places, that you can insulate yourself from some of that. But I would never suggest that you don't take it seriously and prepare yourself, build a network of women. There are more women going into leadership positions than there were 5-10 years ago. So you have allies in places that we did not before. And yeah, I think just when you're in interviews, it's scary, it feels uncomfortable, but make sure that you're asking questions about team culture, about how many women are on your projects or people of marginalized genders. And I think, I care a lot about, I don't know. It's hard. That's my long and rambling answer. Hopefully it gives you something.
That was great. Thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions? As I said, and then you can also send them into the chat if you'd like to, and I'll read them out for you.
I can certainly say I've tried to teach my students burn down charts and Gantt charts, and it's usually an uphill battle to get them to adapt. And it's really hard for a small studio, like a student group, to find good tools for those that are free and easy to use. Because a lot of times the student groups, they don't have any budget for anything because it's a class. So, but we try. And yes, on the aspect of trying for your dream job. Obviously, I dreamed of working at Lucasfilm as a kid, and then eventually got into LucasArts and did it. So at least try for that. But what she's absolutely correct, what's going to make you stay is when the people are really great to work with. And you can't overvalue the great people enough. So.
Thank you. I had one question. You mentioned that you, while working on like Ben 10 and PHL Collected, have worked as like a writer on the project as well, and then kind of found your way into game production. What was kind of your, in as brief a summary as you can, I guess, your route there? How did you know you wanted to work in game production? And did it just kind of fall into your lap one day, or did you do specific things that really made you stand out in that role and then got that job later?
Yeah, I did. I started in the industry as a writer, which is funny because I feel like that is the job so many people want and are trying to find their way towards. And embarrassingly, like the situation at that point was a little bit different, where there were more indie games in production, and a lot of them were looking for writers on things like Reddit. And seriously, I was looking for job postings on like forum boards, and a lot of times I worked for free because I was 16 or 17, and that's what I wanted to be doing with my time. That's not really a sustainable way to become a game writer or move into that industry. But yeah, I did build that skill up. And then when I worked at Island Officials, I came in as like a designer or writer type role, and very quickly started seeing ways that we could improve process. And after a period of time, we were working on some games that didn't really require much text or design work. And I kind of took on the role of like a project manager and continued to build that skill as we made bigger and bigger games and started working with clients. And then I was pretty lucky that I got the position at PHL Collective. Actually, one of the adjuncts, I believe, at Drexel, I think they still teach, Steph, who had recommended me for that position. I met them through Philly Game Mechanics, and they knew that I had experience as a producer, project manager. And I definitely realized that that was more my interest, because to me, it felt more sustainable to do more of that like businessy type, project managey type work for 40 hours, usually more per week, as opposed to that creative work that I felt that I would quickly burn out on when I had to sit down and do it every week for projects that, you know, you may or may not be very interested in. And I still take on writing jobs sometimes. Like I was a producer at PHL Collective, but they needed a writer. So I was like, okay, and continued to do that job after I had left as well for a while. So yeah, that was kind of my trajectory on that. I think there is a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to read it unless you want to take over and read it yourself.
Go ahead.
So yeah, question from Lewis. Any advice on tips for students outside of the game design majors on catering their resume towards a game development position?
Like computer engineering or non-gaming focused computer science. Oh, okay, I see. So you're coming from a non-game development background and you want to tailor your resume into a game development studio. Tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's what you meant. Great. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty typical. And I think if you're working in a technical field, it's much easier to pivot into the game industry than it is from something like, you know, film writing or something like that. It is more difficult to pivot because there's just less demand for some of those roles. So from the perspective of writing a resume or creating a resume, I would definitely suggest read the job description multiple times and try and highlight the things in the job posting that feel the most important. So are they looking for someone who has experience with live development? Are they looking for someone who has experience leading a team, etc.? And then find the ways that you can incorporate any experience you have with that into your resume, even for roles that are not game development focused. So, you know, even if we've hired junior producers who have no experience being a producer, but maybe they were an assistant librarian, right? And if they can sell me on why that has skills that overlap, that's great. And there's no reason why you shouldn't hire someone from another industry if they have the skills that you need and can, especially if they can speak about games and are familiar with the process of making games. That's a huge, huge plus. So yeah, hopefully that helps, but definitely like, yeah, try and tailor it towards the job description itself. Because usually they're just telling you what they want you to do. They just want someone who has those skills. And if you can tell them, yes, I have those skills, here's why you should hire me. I don't think it'll matter, especially in a technical role, whether you come from the game development industry.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little past 7 right now, so I don't want to hold anyone up any longer, but thank you so much. This talk was awesome. For those who maybe arrived late or just want to hear it again, this will be uploaded to the EGS YouTube channel. And as you see here, Rachel does have her email and Twitter up. So if you have any more questions, feel free to send that her way. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone for coming. It was so nice to meet you, Rachel.
Yeah.
And I hope everyone has a good night.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
very much. It was great.